Hello and welcome to this Blender tutorial in which we will be making this Sci-fi power cell. We'll cover every step of the process involved in creating it and rendering that final scene. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Once you've opened up Blender and started a general scene, you'll want to add our reference images. I've made reference images available to you on Google Drive. There's a link down below in the description. But for now, I'm going to assume that you have already done that. If not, pause and come back in a second. Once you've downloaded all the files, we'll go to Shift-A for Add, go down to Image and Reference. And we'll put in our location for our reference images, and here is front. We want this image to display a little differently than the default. So let's go to Image Properties on the Properties panel. Change it to front. It will only display on the front of it. Depth is going to be front as well. This will put it over top of the model that we're working on. But now that we've put it over top of things, we're going to need to turn on opacity. So that is over here, this checkbox, and turn it down to something like 0.3. And there you'll see we have an image that we can see through. Let's hit 7 on the numpad to look down. Shift-A, add another reference image. Now, when you're moving the camera around, if you do not want these images to show up while you're in perspective mode, and you only want it to show up when you're on these dead-on front views, you would uncheck this box that says perspective. That is a preference of yours. I like to have it on so that when I'm looking around, I can see them. It doesn't really do anything for me practically. Let's start blocking out our model. Now before we move on, let's make sure that we scale this to something a correct size. Right now we've got this enormous image. If we hit Shift-A, let's add a cube, and this will just be for scaling things. We're going to make it 20 centimeters across. I'll put that in the X, the Y, and the Z, and we want that to be 0.2. There it is. Let's select all of our images, and we're going to scale them down until the width of our reference image, or rather the cell on the reference image, is roughly the same as our box. This isn't massively important to get exactly right. We just want to have something that's a believable size so that when you bring your model into your other scenes, it's not just some ginormous thing. This X line on 0 is going to be our floor plane, so I brought the bottom of the model, or where the model will be, up there. Let's start by adding in a mesh. We're going to say Shift-A again. Under Mesh, we'll add a circle, and we want that circle to have 24 vertices. And the size is going to be 0.2, approximately. 0.1, because this is the radius, not across it. And let's just start by tabbing into edit mode, and you can go into whatever mode you want, if it's vertices or edge select mode. I like edge select mode, so I'm going to, in edit mode, not in object mode, move these up on the Z to about there, and I'm going to Shift-D to duplicate that on the Z, bring it up to about there, and both of these I'm going to Shift-Alt. So Alt-click is you will select a ring, that is all the edges that are end to end, and we're going to scale Shift-Z so that it scales on only the X and Y. It excludes Z. Now that we have those two rings, we can say Control E for Edge Tools and L for Bridge. Bridge does not start with L. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but there it is. And we will scale this, again excluding Z. Bring that out. So that's where our glass is going to be. Let's select both of these again. Extrude, and that is E to extrude. Now, if I hit escape, it's extruded, but they haven't gone anywhere. So what we can do is we can scale them on the Z-axis to about there. And this one, let's just move it down a little bit. If you double tap G, G is normally move or translate. Double tapping G will lock it to the edge that is selected to or connected to. So I'm going to bring that right in line with that seam, and I'm going to extrude again on the Z up to this edge. And you'll see our circle is a little smaller than our drawing. So in face select mode, that's 3 across the top of the keyboard. Hit Alt when clicking on a border between two faces, and it will take that ring of faces. Shift Alt will add to your selection in the same way. So let's go into front select mode or front view, and we will scale this on everything except the Z again. And that looks pretty good. Let's grab our top edge with Alt and 2 across the number pad will take you into edge mode. Extrude on the Z, about there, and scale it in till its angle is about the same as the drawing. Control plus will expand your selection. I want to move this up just a little bit. It doesn't have to be exact. I'm just being very, I don't know, particular. There we go. So now we're starting to get the shape of our power cell. This will extrude and scale in. Now let's go into wireframe mode. So Z4 on the number pad. And we're going to turn on snapping. Shift Tab will turn on snapping, or you can click up here and select vertex. And down here, select scale, so that scaling also snaps. We're going to scale this excluding Z, so Shift Z, and snap it to this edge of the glass. That way it's the same circumference as that. Let's turn off our snapping because that will get in the way. Extrude on the Z, and let's select these faces. Scale excluding Z. So we didn't want it exactly where we had it anyway. Take this lower edge, extrude down on the Z, scale in, and there it is. Now let's go into top view. Sorry. We'll want to grab our top edge first. Now in top view, we'll extrude and scale. And let's, for the time being, extrude that down on the Z, I don't know, about 0.3. That's 0.03, negative 0.03. And we'll extrude that again on the Z. And looking at the top view, we can scale that in to match there. Now we're going to have to close off the ends of this cylinder at some point. So let's extrude this again, scale it in, and if we hit Control F, grid fill is what we want. So hitting G or clicking grid fill will fill that with a grid, and doing so maintains all quads. I don't know how familiar you are with some of the principles of hard surface modeling, but if something is going to be transformed in any way, or rather deformed, you want it to have quads all over the place, not triangles or n-gons, which are 5 or more. So quads are the way to go. So let's go to the bottom. Extrude and scale here. This also gets extruded up. And if wireframe just isn't working for you, Z and 6 on the numpad will take you back to solid view. And we're going to do the same thing here. We're going to extrude and scale in. Control F G. Now, the reason I am extruding and scaling in before doing a grid fill is because anytime you have an edge, you want supporting geometry around it when you're going to be adding a subdivision surface, which we are. So this is our basic shape. So let's move on to some details. Before I move on to details, let's create another collection. So we're going to say new collection, and let's call this reference. And we'll take all our reference images and put them in there, and we're going to turn off that collection. And I like to call my primary collection working. Really doesn't do anything besides tell me what it is. Let's go into top view, and you'll notice on that detail image that is in color in the Google Drive folder that there are screws or bolts all the way around here, and they have these kind of cylinders that stick up. So in top view, we'll go into edit mode, select this edge, Shift S will bring up your cursor selection or cursor placement menu, and we're going to say cursor to selected. And this is where we're going to add another cylinder and make it join to this angled face. So in order to do that, we first need to know how many vertices we have around the outside. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We want more than that. So let's put one ring around there. Control R, double click, or click and escape. We'll put it right in the center. If you were to scroll your scroll wheel, that'll give you more edges. So tab out into object mode, and now that we have 8 vertices around here, we can add a cylinder, or rather a circle, and give it 8 vertices. Scale it down to where it will fit with some room to breathe, and we'll bring that up to where we can see it all. Alright, so let's give this a modifier, and that is going to be the shrink wrap modifier. Now, before we apply any kind of modifiers, or we're not applying the modifiers yet, that is a specific term in which hitting apply will make the modifier permanent. It'll change your mesh to reflect what the modifier is doing. If you don't apply it, a modifier can be changed, reversed, removed, whatever you want to do with it. It's a non-destructive workflow. Anyway, before doing that, we want to make sure that our scale is correct. So if scale is 1 on the X, Y, and Z, you're fine. However, if it is not, your modifiers are not going to work the way you expect them to. So if it is not applied, we can hit Control A, and we're going to apply the scale. That way it's a 1-to-1 scale. We won't get any funny stuff going on. So here in our shrink wrap modifier, under target, we'll hit the eyedropper and select the cylinder, the power cell. And we want this wrap method to be project on the Z and negative. So now if you look down from the top, you still have your perfect circle, but it is projected on this surface. Now we are going to apply a modifier, and that is here. We'll go apply, and now that has actually affected the mesh, and it is in that shape. So what we can do is take this, shift select our primary object, and Control J, and they are now part of the same mesh object. If we tab into edit mode and vertex select, delete that center one, and we'll go back into edge mode, Control E and L again for bridge. There you go, you've filled in the circle. Now, I know we filled in the ends of our cylinder. We really didn't want to do that yet. So let's take these faces, delete, so X or delete will bring up your delete menu, and you want to delete faces. You can hit delete and then hit F rather than clicking on things. And we're going to do the same at the bottom. Why are we doing this, you might ask? Well, we are going to use an array modifier to save us some work. So delete F. Now that we've deleted these capped areas, what we can do is go to face selection mode by hitting 3 across the top of the numpad, and Alt click, and you can see that selects the entire way down. And we're going to Alt select here. So leave one row on the one side of your circle, and delete faces. Select one of these, Control L. So Control L will select all linked geometry to what you have selected. Control I will invert that, and hitting delete V will delete all other vertices. Now, we can add a special kind of object called an empty. But to do that, we need to be in object mode. So tab out, Shift A, empty, plane axis, and the size of this doesn't really matter, but I think that's obnoxiously large. So I'll hit the Properties tab over here, bring it down to 0.5. Don't scale this to get the size you want. You will not get proper results, or rather the results you're expecting from any modifiers you're using with it. So where this comes into play is we're going to add an array modifier to our cylinder. So let's go to modifiers, add array, and we want 8 instances of our part. However, that's not what we want. We want it to go in a circle. So uncheck relative offset and go to object offset. And let's select our empty object. And if you see, we can rotate our empty, and if we rotate it on Z, we're going to get our complete cylinder back the way we started. But rather than try and eyeball this, just rotate on Z 45. You can type that up here, or you can type it on the keyboard just after hitting R. Now, what we want to do is come back here, and I actually want our reference back on. Now let's go to top view. And what I want to do is make sure that our holes are kind of the size we want, and they might be a little small. So let's scale them rather, let's go into edit mode. Select that ring and scale a little bit. So now that looks all right. At this point, we may want to add our subdivision surface modifier to smooth out all this stuff that we're looking at. All these facets are not really giving us an idea of what the final thing is going to look like. So let's collapse our array modifier over here and add a subdivision surface modifier all the way at the bottom. And you'll want, under advanced, I'm sorry, no, we're not going to use advanced, we're just going to do this. Let's crank that up to 2. And under our array modifier, you'll see that we still have these kind of edges. We can turn on merge and expand that a little bit, because if you come around here, there's one that hasn't merged, and that's the end point. So first and last need to merge as well. If we right click and hit shade smooth, it looks terrible. That is because we don't have enough supporting lines, edges rather, or beveled edges to make this tighten up where it needs to and smooth where it shouldn't. So for the time being, let's actually disable that. And an interesting thing is happening with our shapes of our circles. That is because of the merge distance of our array. So add another 0 in there, and that's a large enough space, or to be that anything that's within this distance of each other will merge together. So we want it to be 1 millimeter. Now let's tab back in, and you'll notice this is the only mesh we have. In fact, let's go back to flat and go into front view, turn on our reference, extrude up. And now if we hit scale 0 on scale Z and 0, it will scale to 0 on the Z axis. Back into snapping mode, let's move this down on the Z again and make that even with this rim. E, scale in. These are where our bolts are going to go that presumably keep the top on this thing and keep all that radiation or whatever's inside. Bring that down, and this, yes, we're going to maintain a control edge on this as well. So E to extrude, scale in, control F, G. It's not going to be super important here because we're actually not going to see it. So at this point, I think we'll go around our model and start adding bevels on the edges that we want to remain sharp. But before we do that, we're going to apply our array modifier, since this was the work that we wanted to save ourselves some effort on, these circles, these cylinders at the top. So as you can see, we've only got this mesh data. We want the entire thing. So over in array, make sure array is the first modifier in the stack. Hit this arrow down and apply. Now when we go in here, you can see that it's an entire mesh again. We did not need to do that particularly, but I think it'll make it simpler to follow along moving forward. Now for those bevels. All edges need bevels because nothing in real life actually has perfectly flat, perfectly sharp edges. If you want a realistic look, you do need to bevel everything. And the amount of bevel matters as well. So you don't want things to be too blown out and cartoony looking. We want something that resembles a metal object to some extent here. So that's a few of them selected. There's going to be more, but what we'll do once we have beveled edges selected, we will mark them as mean bevel weight of 1 over here on the toolbar. And what that will do is add bevels only on those edges when we add a bevel modifier. There are a few ways to implement a bevel modifier. We will be using this mean crease. So this limit method under the bevel modifier should be changed to weight. And I'm going to go around the model here in kind of a high-speed mode, redoing the same thing over and over. But before I do that, let's change some things. We want 2 edges on our bevel. I find that an even number makes it easier to UV unwrap later, And the amount of bevel, this is what I was talking about, not going extreme. That might be too much actually. So 0.0005, how's that look? Now when we enable our subdivision modifier, now we have this. So if we were to disable our bevel, it's just mush. You enable it and you have that edge preserved. So I'm going to go around the model and do this. I don't need to keep explaining it the whole time because I'll be doing the same thing over and over for a few minutes here. And there we have it. We have a fairly good looking mesh. Here you'll notice we have some shading issues. One reason for that is that we have these long distances with no subdivisions across them. That is not great for the subdivision surface modifier. It has to kind of work too hard to curve. The way it works is you take 3 edges and you make a curve between them. When you have a really long edge before the next curve, it does not end up looking good. Another reason in this case is that I believe our normals are not facing all in the same direction. The normal is kind of in this case it's the direction that the face is facing, where the outer edge, the outer side or the front side, which was kind of how we set our reference images. They only project on the front of the plane. That is the normal side, or the normal out side. So the way we would fix this on this model is in edit mode, face selection, select them all, and Shift N is the normalize normals, or the recalculate normals. You can decide which side it's going to be on, but blue is the front facing side, and that is what we want out. Red is the back facing side. So let's go up here and turn off face orientation. There we go. Now it's time to turn off our reference again, and we can go in here and cap off these ends again. Control F G, Control F G. Alright, so the primary part is mostly complete. However, we want a seam around here, and we want thickness to our glass, and our glass actually should be a separate part. So let's start there. Let's select our faces for our glass and hit P, and that will separate. And you can decide how you want to separate what you have selected. Selection is what we want now. So now we have 2 different objects. Let's name them at this time. So you can double click them in the outliner, or you can hit F2 to bring up a rename, and we'll call that glass. And for lack of a better term, we'll call this caps. There we go. And our empty is no longer needed. We'll delete that. Now, if ever you get lost in your viewport, you can hit home to bring it right back to center. Or it doesn't bring it back to center. It shows everything that's in the scene in the viewport at once. So if I had like a bunch of stuff scattered all over the screen and suddenly I couldn't see any of it, if I hit home, I would come back to a point where I could see all of it at once, and then I could zoom in to wherever I needed to be. So now let's go into local view for our glass. That is the slash on the numpad. We are going to add another modifier, and that is going to be the solidify modifier. Bring solidify all the way to the top, so it's the first thing in the process of going through the modifiers. Right now, that I had kind of a thick glass set on my original model. I think that 0.01 looks pretty good. It's that looks good. So what we're going to do now is bring this back to a point, or to scale this up on a Z. And we're going to do that in edit mode. So select everything, scale on the Z, and bring it up to where it is past the edge of the caps. And let's select our cap and go into local mode on that. And what we're going to do is select this edge and this edge, extrude, and scale them on the Z. And E, scale excluding Z. And let's take the mean bevel weight down to 0 on that. Control F G. Control F G. Alright, so let's go back to our glass again and take it right up to the edges of where we put those capped regions. So scale on the Z. Close enough. Doesn't have to be very exact. We're not going to really see that edge anyway. This has a seam across the front, if you noticed in the references. So what I'm going to do is, we already put an edge here, and what we can do is hit V, and that rips it. It'll rip whatever seam you have selected. If I hit escape, it's going to sit exactly where it was. And I'm going to hit Control L for everything attached to it or linked to it. And I'm going to hit Shift H for hide all but selected. And we're going to take this edge, E, and scale in a little bit, and take this outer one and make sure that gets a bevel. There we go. So let's tab in again. Now Alt H will unhide everything. I'm going to Shift H on this portion. E, scale in, and mark this. Now we have a pretty good looking edge or seam. Alright, next we're going to put a handle across here. So let's unhide everything. And if we go into top-down mode, and let's turn off our subdivision and our bevel so we can see exactly what we're doing. Tapping 2 on the number pad will kind of tilt us downward a little bit. And what we want to do, first I should see if I'm in the right spot. I am. So let's put one edge loop through here. We're going to be putting another circle in here, the way we did these cylinders on the top for the bolt mounts. So select that vertex, Shift S, cursor to selected, and let's go to wireframe so we can really see what we're doing. Front view, and out into object mode, we're going to create a new object, and that is a circle. Now, by default, a new object faces up. Here, within the Align dropdown, we can say Align to View, and it will face the camera, or face where you're looking from. And we'll bring this down much smaller. Whoa. Okay, let's say 0.1. Good enough. We'll scale it from there. And that looks, well, that actually looks pretty good, so 0.111. Hit Control A, at least apply the scale. You can apply rotation and scale if you like. I don't know that it will make much of a difference here. And let's move it on the y-axis a little bit away from that edge, or from those faces. Now, I'm going to take off smooth and turn on shading. Let's add a modifier. You guessed it, it is a shrink wrap. And we're going to change it to project on the Y. And that is the positive direction. Alright. Now, we made a mistake, or I made a mistake. There are too many vertices here. We would need to add a whole lot more detail to this mesh out here. So what I'm going to do is just redo that real quick. We'll delete that, Shift A, circle, view, 8 vertices, and we know we want this to be 0.111. Maybe that was a 0.111. Okay. Anyway, that looks pretty good. Control A, rotation and scale, and we'll add the shrink wrap again. Okay, so we're going to project only on Y. Let's apply this because we want that shape to be final. Shift, select the primary object, and Control J. Now they are one object. We're going to take these faces and delete the faces. We're going to do the same on the opposing side. So 7. These 4, delete. Now, without using a mirror modifier, what I'm going to do is duplicate this geometry that we create over to the other side. So let's select this ring and this ring, Control E, L, and we're going to put our cursor back to the world origin and choose the cursor as our reference point. Now, if we Shift D to duplicate, see this, hit R, rotate. So we have a problem. What is our problem? Nope, I just did not select the Z-axis. I was rotating according to the viewport. So let's rotate 180. There it is. Now we want to select all of our vertices because you'll notice there's overlapping geometry and they don't actually join up. So if we select them all with A, hit space for search or F3 depending what you have set up. That's an option on the splash screen when you first start. We will say merge by distance. And now you can set how close things are, how close things have to be to merge, much like we did with the merge option on the array modifier. Now let's take this and this ring, Control E, L, and we've bridged them. We also want to bevel these. And if we turn our modifiers back on, by the way, this monitor icon hides the modifier in the viewport. The camera hides it in the render. So if you have something looking like this and then you render and it looks like that, it's because you had this turned off here and not here. So shade smooth again, and that is looking pretty good. One thing I would like to do is add the handle grip pattern now. So Shift S, cursor here, and interesting. Okay, there we go, front view, and we're going to Shift A and we'll add another circle. Or no, let's add a cylinder. And make this 40. We did this in edit mode, and now it's applying the subdivision to it. We don't want that, so I'm going to delete that geometry. Now in object mode, it'll create a new object. Mesh, cylinder, 40. Let's align to the view and scale that way down. This is going to have like a diamond grip pattern. Let's make it as big as our reference. About there. Control A, rotation and scale. Now, this is going to remain a separate part because we're applying modifiers to all of this, and if we join this, it'll take the same modifiers and smooth shading. And we don't want smooth shading on this just because it's a bunch of small details that are easier to portray if we don't have smooth shading on. Let's Control R and about 40 cuts. Select all of our faces and hit space again, or F3, and look for poke faces. There you go. Now select one that would be in the center of an X. I'll take one on this edge, and Shift G, that is to select things that are similar in some way, and the way that they're going to be similar is the amount of adjacent faces. Now we can scale these omitting the Y axis. And there we have our diamond grip pattern. That looks pretty cool. Alright, let's turn our attention down to the other end, and keeping our reference images on and placing our cursor at the world origin, again that is Shift S1 or click that, we're going to add another cylinder, or another circle rather, and that is going to have 24 vertices, and it can be a little larger than that. Set it. Control A, rotation and scale. Now, let's extrude everything in edit mode on the Z. Bring it about in line there. And we're going to take, you know what, let's go to wireframe mode. In wireframe mode, when you select, it selects through. So even the things you can't see are selected when they're blocked by other vertices or something like that. So let's delete those vertices, grab these edges, and we're going to extrude them up. And now let's go back to solid. And one more thing will be, before we can actually turn off these references, is going to be the little electrical contacts that stick down. So let's add a cube. Scale that way down. Let's go into edit mode so that we're not moving the origin off of 0. Wow, that's actually right on there. And we're going to scale on the Z, and my reference point is still the 3D cursor. If we go back to median point, it'll be a little more predictable. There we go. And we want that to be fairly narrow. Let's take these two edges. We're going to Control B to bevel. And yeah, let's give it a few. So by default it's 1. Scroll up a little bit and see how they overlap each other. If we hit C for constrain, it will bevel until it runs into the next bevel. Now it created the same problem as we had up top with overlapping geometry. So select all and merge. Merge by distance. Now let's fix up our geometry a bit because this is a huge n-gon. J will join those, and over here J. Control R to put 1 edge loop in the middle here. These are all quads. Now in a moment I'm about to break the all quads rule, but for now this we're going to keep with it. Let's add let's take this contact and our little guard here, and now our references are getting in the way. So let's select both of these and then shift select the object above it, and we're going to Control L to link data. We're going to copy modifiers, so they got all weird looking. So let's take just these and go into local, and this one could use a solidify, so we're going to go down here, solidify. Let's see, how thick should that be? That was probably pretty good to start with. Put solidify at the top, and we're going to select our border edges and give those a bevel weight of 1. Let's do the same thing over here. Bevel weight of 1. There we go. Shade smooth. Give that a few more subdivisions. Looks good. Alright. Now, over here, we're going to create a problem and then use kind of break the rules to kind of fix it. So if we take our solidify and we apply, you can see that we have some edges here that we can add our bevel weight of 1 to, and that fixes some of the problem. However, this little area, if we put a bevel weight of 1 on there, we get some weird shading. An easy way to fix this is to bevel this just a tad, and then we're going to take these, put a bevel weight on there. These original ones do not need it. And what about the back side? Yes. So now we do have n-gons introduced into the mix. However, they're not very visible, and the camera's not going to be this close in the render anyway. We have some odd shading a little bit, but it's not going to be noticeable. So what we're going to do now is add a mirror, and this one is going to copy that one. So Control L, modifiers. There we go. Let's name these things. Contacts. And that is most of the modeling. There is one section left that needs to be done, and that is the internal parts. So if I select the glass and hit H, that will hide it. Let's go 1, bring back our references, and we're going to add 2 more reference images. Alright, let's put our cursor at the center of our other references because we want our new reference images to have the same scale and area. So, or rather, it's same central point, so it all scales correctly together. So let's Shift S, cursor to selected, Shift A, and we're going to go down to our images, reference, and we need our elements. And that's interesting. So we scaled our other ones, our other reference images before we had these in, so we're going to have to eyeball these a little bit. Shift A, image, reference image, this guy. Alright. So these two are huge. Let's scale them down to about there. Okay. Now that we have all of our references in place, we'll hit Shift A and we're going to add a cube. We're going to scale it way down. We're going to rely heavily on our mirror modifier for this. Tab into edit mode, GX, bring that over here, scale it down a little more. Alright, now out in object mode, press Control A to apply our scale, because we did scale it before going into edit mode. And we can scale it on the Z. Whoa, we just flew off the screen. If we go to wireframe mode, we can scale that on the Z and know exactly where we're ending up. There we go. That looks good. If your cursor was at the middle of your reference image for the element pieces, your scale should line up top and bottom, and we should be able to cut right across the center. Go into side view, select everything, and scale it on the Y, just down to that center piece. Alright, so now that we have this division, let's add a loop cut around the center this way, and a loop cut around this side. So each angle has now been subdivided one time. Let's select all of the bottom and delete those vertices, and select all of the back, delete those vertices. Now you'll see we just have this kind of incomplete piece. We're going to take off even more, delete that middle one, and we're going to add a mirror modifier. That's this butterfly, and we'll mirror on all 3 axes. That way we have very little work to do for something that's just going to be repetitive. So back to front view. I think wireframe is going to work best for this. Put one loop cut across here, and we'll move that up about there, and select these faces that go around here. Until now we've been hitting E to extrude. I want you to hit Alt E, and that will give you a few more options. Extrude along normals. We discussed what normals are. Those are the front faces, or the direction that a face is facing. Let's bring it out to about there, and down here on this menu, or the F9 menu, hit Offset Even. Then we won't get any of these wonky angles that sometimes happen with that kind of an action. Select this ring, or rather, so now we have an interesting issue. We have faces inside of the model. I don't know if you can tell by looking right at this, but these are on the inside, and they will mess up our shading, and they don't need to be there because they're on the inside anyway. So delete F. Now if we select this ring, go to front view, And Control-Shift-Alt-S is a new one, that is shear. Right now it's not doing anything. Hit Y, and that will shear on the Y axis according to your viewport. Y is up and down, X is left and right. Now we have that shape that we were going for. Let's select the middle edge loop the whole way around, and you'll see it's just this front portion since we have mirroring on. And we will Control B to bevel that, and Control R in the middle and make that 2. No, that's not going to be what we want to do. Just one loop, and we'll bevel that as well. And bring that out there. There we go. Now, we're going to take this face, this face, this face, extrude on the Z, right there, and that looks pretty good. And we'll take this face, and actually all of these front-facing ones, so that we have that entire front face selected. We can extrude to there. Now if we take this front section right here, we can extrude on the Z again. That's not what we wanted to do. We want to not get these bottom ones and extrude these along their normal direction. Now take the bottom portions here. This might be easier to see in solid view, like that. And it looks like I did not set our reference image to be on the front. So what we can do is we can fix that, whichever one it is. There it is, and we'll do the same with our side view. Alright, so now we can see what we're doing even in solid view. So we'll take only these three, extrude them down on Z. There we go. Now we have that kind of Art Deco looking shape. Now, this is going to present a little bit of a problem. The way we have this, we need to separate some geometry because of the material that we will put on the blue portion in the middle. It's going to be transparent, and we're going to see up into here. So let's take this loop, this kind of dividing edge between the two sections, alright, let's hide these. There we go. This entire back border. There we go. And we're going to extrude that on the Z and scale it on the Z, hitting 0 so it becomes flat. And move it up to almost the top, or wherever you like. And take only that leading edge. And we're going to extrude on the Y until it stops. So here's something you need to know about the mirror modifier. If you do not turn on clipping, these edges will go right past each other into the other side of the mesh, and that creates overlapping geometry and things don't merge correctly. So turn on clipping, and as you move that toward the Y, it will just stop at the center line. However, we still have some that won't auto merge things. If you want vertices that land on each other to become one vertice to merge, turn on this option here. However, I'm doing it kind of the manual way because I've had trouble with things getting close and then merging, and I didn't want them to. So let's continue hiding all the things that are not involved in that top part. Now if we go to vertex selection mode, select all, it will only affect things that we can see. Anything hidden will not be affected here. And merge by distance. There we go. We've gotten rid of any unwanted geometry. Alt-H will unhide everything, and let's hide our reference. There it is. That is the end of the modeling, except one thing. We need some bolts across the top. And I've realized one other thing. We have some things that are connected in wonky ways. So let's just alt-click these faces and hide them again. And what we want, yes, so let's Control L, Shift H while we have these selected. There we go. Take our leading edge here, and here if we turn on auto merge, extrude along the Y. These vertices that overlap each other have now merged on their own. So that's good. Alt-H. That's the end of that modeling. Now the last bit of modeling before we move on to lighting and materials will be the bolts that go around the top. With one of our caps selected, the top cap, we'll select the center vertex of the place where we want our bolts to align. It's easiest if it's right on an X or a Y center. So Shift S, cursor to selected, and tap out into object mode because we're going to create a new object. Shift A, and this circle is only going to have 6 vertices. And 0.001 is probably a good radius. So let's scale that till we can see it. Right about there, till we just can't see the edges. Control A, rotation and scale. Now we are going to be making use of our radial array again, as well as the loop tools. So let's extrude this in to where we want the hole for the wrench to go, and that's going to be right there. Select all of the spokes and bevel them so it's not just one plane but two faces. So you have one click up on your scroll wheel, and if you activated loop tools, you can select the outer ring here, right click and hit circle. You'll need to rotate that till it lines up. Doesn't have to be exact because we don't have a way to make it exact. If you do know of a way, please let me know. Let's put an edge loop here. Now we want it to match the circle edge, so if we hit E, it'll justify to an edge. If you find that it has it's still keeping the hexagon shape, press F and that will flip the edge that it is aligning to. So we want it to be the outer one, and it looks like we need to apply our circle again, and that looks all right. So let's select it all, bring it up to where we want it to be. Take this inner ring up, and if you want a different shape for your bolt heads, that is fine, but this is how I like to make them. Take that down, E, scale, Control F, G. There we go. Now let's take this outer ring and extrude that on the Z to where you're just not going to see the bottom of it. And select all of our rings that go in a circle. These are our bevel edges. We're going to mark them with a bevel weight of 1. Now we can add our bevel modifier, change it to weight. Bring this to 0.0005 about. Make this 2 segments. We want it to be even smaller than that. Let's say 0.0002. Even 1. There we go. That looks good. And Control 1 or Control 2 will add a subdivision surface modifier if you don't want to click over here. It's used so much that it has a shortcut key. I always use 2 subdivisions as a rule, basically. It tends to look good without adding too much geometry to your final render. If you find that it's too heavy for your viewport and things are really slowing down, you can change levels in viewport to 1 while you keep your render level higher. That way it won't slow down your viewport, but when you render it out, it'll still have all the detail you want it to have. And 0 is basically turning it off. We'll change that to smooth with a right click. Now we're ready to add an array modifier to this. However, there's one thing we need to do first, and I'll show you the problem first and then show you the solution. Under View, I'm going to move our cursor to the center while keeping it on the same Z altitude. And I'm going to add a empty. Again, way too big. There we go. We want this to have an array modifier. After everything else, it's going to be an object array. Select our empty, and you'll see already it's doing something we did not expect. Change it to 8, and they're going in a straight line. Alright, well, we have to rotate this. So rotate on the Z 45 degrees. They're not placing where you'd expect them to. That is because the origin point of the object that is being arrayed is not the same as the empty object. An easy fix for that is to select your object, right click, and set your origin to 3D cursor. And now you'll see the dot is over here. That is the origin point of the object. So if we turn off array, that's still the origin. And if you scale and such, that's the point from which it will scale or rotate or whatever you do with it. However, we just want it to array correctly at this point. So there we have it. All of our modeling is complete, and we just have 4 simple materials to make, so we can make this start looking like something real rather than just a clay kind of gray thing. To do that, you can hit shading, or you can create your own workspace by grabbing a corner, dragging up, and changing this to our shader editor. We'll want to change our viewport to Material Preview, which is Z and 2 on the numpad, or this icon up here. So looking at our object, it's just white because we have no materials on it. In order to add a material, we're going to select an object and hit New on the shader editor. And here we have the default principled BSDF, which is where we will be plugging in all of our different values. We will be using base color, metallic, roughness, and transmission when we get to glass, and of course normal. I say of course if you don't know about normals other than facing directions of a face, we'll get to that in a little bit. So just as a quick overview, changing the base color will change the base color, obviously. If we zoom in here, roughness changes how glossy or rough it is. It's pretty simple. And normal, we'll get to that. We're going to have to use a normal map. But of course, nothing in the real world is just completely shiny or completely rough. There are variations across the surface, and that is what gives us a realistic look in any kind of realistic shader. So in order to do that, we're going to introduce some maps, such as roughness, color, and normal maps. So where do we get those? Well, I like to use a site called 3D Assets 1. Once you're on 3dassets.1, type in metal. And here you'll have all these materials or texture packs that you can download for free. And they are CC0, that is a Creative Commons level of licensing that allows you to modify them, reuse them, redistribute them however you like. Let's look for a rather shiny but scratchy metal. And I believe there's one called Metal 03. The way to find the metal that we are going to use, you'll have to select the source that you want to look at, because this site is looking at a number of different sites that have free assets on them for you to download. Ambient CG has what we're looking for. So if we select that and hit search, it will only show metal materials that are on Ambient CG. Let's scroll down, and what we're looking for is this, Metal 003. Select it, choose the texture size that you want. In this case, we're going to use a 2K map. 1K is entirely too small for most cases. If you have an object that's not very close to the camera at all, but you want it to look like it has some detail, that might do the trick. 2K is pretty good. 4K is usually just too big if you have too many of them in a scene and you don't have a great graphics card. So 2K is a good medium. 16 megabytes is the size of the JPEGs. You can see PNGs are much larger. PNG looks a lot better in my opinion, and I think that that's just because there's less compression involved, or it's better compression rather. So once you click that, download the texture set that you want in the size that you want and save it somewhere, and make sure you know where that is. It'll probably be your downloads folder if you haven't changed anything on your computer. Back in Blender, there's a number of ways you can add that texture that we just downloaded. We will be using the Node Wrangler add-on in order to do that. It saves us a few steps, and it's something you do repetitively all the time, so you'll want to do that. You can go up here, it's included with Blender. You say Node Wrangler up here and put a check next to it. That'll activate it, and that will give us a few shortcut keys to use in the node editor that save us a lot of time. For instance, you've downloaded a set of textures and you don't want to use individual nodes. You don't want to add all the individual nodes and all the mapping nodes and all that one by one. You just want one click. Well, Control Shift T while having the principled shader selected will bring up this menu. Find the location where you saved your metal textures and select them, all with the Shift key. So Metal 3 is what we were using. 003, mine is named slightly differently. We want the color, we want the roughness, and we want the normal. We won't be using the metalness map at this time. We can cover that at a different time. Displacement will not be used. It'll just be color, roughness, and normal. And here it plugs them in where we need them without having to do anything. In case you haven't figured out by now, Control space with your cursor over one of the editors will bring it to full screen. I don't know if I covered that earlier. However, it still added metallic. I'm not sure what happened there. I'm going to delete it. Bring this guy down here. Alright, so here we have our maps plugged in exactly where they need to be, and they are being mapped by their UVs, which we have not set up yet. UV unwrapping is the process of taking an object, cutting seams, and laying it all flat like a piece of paper. So if you had a pattern on paper that you would cut out and fold up to make a 3D object, that's what we're doing, just in reverse. So we're not going to go through the full-on marking seams and unwrapping. We're going to use a more automatic process, and that is going to be demonstrated right now. Before we unwrap anything, we'll need to make sure everything has had its scale applied. So let's go down through the list. Contacts have not. Control A, scale, cube, cylinder. We haven't named everything, obviously. Alright, so it looks like everything is scaled correctly. Let's select all and deselect our empty and make one of these our primary. And go into edit mode. And it looks like we could use a little more geometry first. It's good to have mostly squares or something close to it all over your mesh for your, it helps our subdivision surface modifier. So let's start by selecting all faces, hitting, and this just looks like a mess over here right now. This will be our UV map when we're done. We will hit U for our unwrap. Smart UV project is what we will use. Rather than cutting seams all over the place, we're going to use this angle to determine where faces or where seams should be placed on our UV map. So we'll take the default of 66, correct aspect so that it's not scaling in any weird directions, and hit OK. Now, if you have things that seem scaled disproportionately, it is because the objects themselves have not been scaled correctly. So you'll want to apply your scale on everything. However, this map represents all of the faces on our meshes. So if we turn on this little UV sync selection, anything we select here will be selected over there. So you can see exactly where these correspond. Alright. Now that we have everything UV unwrapped the quick way, you can see that down here we can now see the map that we have there. However, it is too large to look correct. So the way to do that is to change the scale on our mapping node here. The larger this number, the smaller your details are going to look. So let's change this to say 4, X and Y. Z does not matter. That might be good for now. You'll see there is a seam here that doesn't exactly line up. If we were manually unwrapping everything, we would make sure our seams were all in just the right places. But we're going to position our camera so that these things do not show. We'll just have to be creative with our camera angle. If we want to apply this same material to all of our pieces, we'll select everything except for the glass, and then shift select the part we were just working on, Control L for link data again, and this time rather than modifiers we'll go to link materials. Now they all have the same thing going on, the same material going on. You'll notice that this does not look very much like metal. It's just like plastic with metal printed on it. That is because there are two different types of materials in the world, metals and not metals. we need to change this to metallic, a metallic value of 1, and that looks really good already. However, some of our faces need paint on them. In my example, I had black paint on all the surfaces and it was kind of wearing off around the edges. We can do that by creating another material. This material name should be changed. And next to it you'll see a number. That is the number of objects that are using this material. Unlink it by clicking the number. Now it will give it a slightly different name, but on this one we're going to call it painted metal because we're going to add some paint. I am no typist. And back here I just don't like having those numbers on there. Change it back. Alright, so this will need to, we want to keep our metal for all the shiny little edges and the scratch, wear and tear areas, but we also need paint. So we need to mix these two groups of, this group of nodes with another group. Let's go into our node editor and hit Shift D. We're going to reuse some of our maps that we already downloaded, or that we have in our scene already, rather. So we want to use the normal of the underlying metal for our paint as well. And what that does for us is, as a quick demonstration, we'll zoom in and you'll see there's all that surface imperfection, all those little bumpy details. If I were to take these and mute them so they're not doing anything, it's completely flat and not very realistic looking. But if we turn them on, we have those surface imperfections. That's what our normal map is for. It gives us a realistic look. It gives us the tiny details that we're not going to actually model. And this is the normal map. It uses RGB channels. Blue is facing directly out, green is the up and down, and red, the red channel is right and left. So it determines small details that aren't actually modeled, but the light will interact with the surface in a way as if those are physical details there. That's basically the long and short of it. Without spending too much time on it, let's move on. We want to mix, so this is going to be our paint. For purposes of showing the obvious difference between the two materials, another thing that we can do is Shift Control click, and that will let us see what the specific node is doing that we have just clicked on. So right now it's doing this, and you can see it has those surface imperfections because it is using this normal map going into here. This node, which says normal map, is basically telling the principal BSDF how to interpret the data coming out of this purple picture, which is a vector map. Let's also use our roughness map from the below texture, and we'll take that to roughness right there. Now of course that is too much. That's too shiny, and our paint is not metallic. So we're going to take the metal down to 0 on that one. And that looks a little more like paint, right? So actually that roughness map might work for that without being adjusted. We're gonna roll with that for a little bit and see how that works out. Right now they're not mixing at all, so what we need is a mix shader node. And these are all the nodes that I'm adding are available in here. I just don't know where all of them are, so I just hit search and type in what I want. So a mix shader is here. Let's put that in there, and this output into that, the top one. Now you'll see they are mixed evenly, and that doesn't look very good at all. It's not metallic, it's not non-metallic, and it just looks bad. What we can do is you can slide this to have more of one than the other, but that doesn't accomplish what we want either in this case. So what we'll do is, let's take that same roughness map, which, by the way, let's show that over here. The darker areas are glossier, the lighter areas are less glossy. So white is 100% rough, black is 100% gloss, and everywhere in between is a sliding scale between the two. So our scratches are rougher than the surrounding areas. So if we plug something into factor, that's what FAC is, factor, it will interpret anything white as being the bottom socket and anything black as being the top socket. But there really isn't enough contrast to get a good looking mix here. So what we can do is turn this to a kind of black and white. We can do that by adding a color ramp. A color ramp will allow us to adjust the contrast between the dark and light areas of that map. And if we control shift click on here, we'll see exactly what we're doing. You don't want a lot of gray here, because as you saw before, actually showing both at the same time doesn't work out. So black and white is the way to go here in this case. So I'll control shift click on our end here again. There we have some scratches. And I don't think that these scratches look very deep at all. So I'm going to change the intensity of the normal map. But right now, let's try and arrange things in a way that is less confusing and hurting the brain. So, I don't know, now our lines aren't going through each other. We can reroute things, but I'm just kind of showing how to do this at the moment and just get things functional. So there we have that, and let's make this a little more intense. So I'm going to take it 4 times as intense. And now it looks maybe a little less realistic, but more dramatic. I like the look of it. You can play with yours until it looks like what you want. Now, I also had these edges wearing. There's another way to do that. And what we can do is add another mix shader. So we'll duplicate this one. And we'll use our same metal, pure metal node here in the bottom. And we're going to use a different type of factor that is more of a procedural type. So let's add a geometry node. Not all the content here is beginner oriented. I'm figuring out as I go here. This might be a little beyond beginner, but now you have a head start. So we want this pointiness factor to go in here. By itself, it doesn't really do a whole lot. We need another color ramp. Keep in mind that anything white is going to be the bottom and anything black is going to be the top. So we want our edges to be white so that this metal shines through because it is in the bottom socket. So let's control shift click here to see exactly what this is looking like. Let's bring this up, bring this down, and what we're going for is mostly black but with white on the edges. And this can take a little while to find, and we do have to be in rendered view to see this. So Z and 8 will give you that. And right now we don't really have any lighting set up, so things might not look perfect, but we just want to see where our dark sections are and where our non-dark sections are. Now, we have this seam around here that we don't have any supporting geometry for, so this node really depends on your mesh being uniform around it. So what I'm going to do is go into edit mode, bring this down, and we'll bring this up. This may have moved our UV map a little bit. So if I go to preview mode at the bottom, has it stretched anything beyond belief? No, I don't think so. So if we go back into this mode, we can see that black is the painted area, white is the just bare metal section. We have a lot of bare metal around here almost. It would be very thin paint. Let's see if we can play with this a little more to get that working. I don't think that's actually going to work out. Go back to this with Control-Shift-Click. There are a lot of ugly seams around like this. It's unseemly. But I'm going to do another video that is just about UV unwrapping. I think you get the concept though that it placed seams automatically based on the angles of the edges, and we didn't tell it exactly where to peel things away. And we can do a much better job if we do it manually. But this is already a long tutorial, so let's move on. Coming up to this handle, we don't want the paint on the handle. I think it should just be metallic. So with it selected, select this drop down and we'll select our other material that we have there. And there it is. Another thing I want to do is have this center section all metallic and not painted. However, we have our paint material on it. So how do we change that? Well, let's come over here and we're going to add a second material slot. So you can have more than one material on an object. And now that you have a slot here, select this drop down, which is just like this other one over here, and select metal. Now it's not going to show up anywhere. So we need to assign areas where it will be. So let's tab into edit mode and we'll select the faces that are this area, and with metal selected here, click assign. There it is. No paint in the middle. We're getting this cool look. Now our bolts, I think they should be metal, so we'll change those to metal. And our contacts, they are going to be metal as well. Now we may want them to be a copper look. We can change that later. But right now, let's move on to our glass. So far we're not using volume and displacement. We will not in this tutorial. Just surface is what we're interested in. Make this completely white because that is completely transparent in this case. We're going to change our transmission to 1 and our roughness to 0. And a material preview that just kind of looks like a chrome kind of a thing. Make sure it is not metallic. Z8 shows us what we're looking at. There is glass there. Let's go back into material preview. Shift A, and we're going to add an image node, image texture. These were added automatically in our first material, but we're going to use a texture that's already in the file, and that is going to be our metal 03 roughness. And let's throw that into the roughness socket and make sure that the color space is non-color. If it's not directly affecting the color of the object, you want it to be non-color. It's a different kind of data. There we go. That looks scratchy, but scratches are too big. So with this image node selected, hit Control T. Alternatively, you could add both these nodes with Shift A, but Node Wrangler gives us that Control T. And let's change these. All right, let's see what we have. Now it's not very glossy at all anywhere. So back here, let's select this, and you'll see, I'm sorry, Control-Shift click with Node Wrangler gives us the direct output from that. Otherwise, Control-Shift click does nothing. We can add a color ramp. Between here and here, I'm going to change my output over here. And we want a whole lot more black in there. Control-Shift click on our last node, and that should look pretty good. We don't have a whole lot of light in our scene, so we really can't see anything. A way to fix that is to go back to 3D Assets 1, and let's just hit search. So there are no filters, it's just everything. Select HDRI Haven. And HDRI, in this case, it's going to be our lighting, and it's going to be a texture that is our world. And so it'll light everything, and it'll give us a background as well, but we're probably going to turn that off. We just want the lighting out of it. So HDRI Haven, click search, and let's find something we like. Let's pick something that's kind of indoor and has some different colors to shine around. Here's one that I like. Artist Workshop. Pick your resolution again. In our case, it's going to show up in our reflections, so we do want a decent resolution. So 4K is all right. Once you start getting 8 and 16K, you're looking at some fairly large files. Maybe that's not big for you, but not everyone's internet connection is fast enough to make that practical. So we're going to do a 4K HDR format, which is smaller. And we'll hit download. Back in Blender, the way we apply that, and remember to be hitting Control S to save along the way. You never want to lose hours of work if you can help it. The way we'll do that is we'll go over to our world properties under color, which right now is just an even gray all the way around. That's why nothing looks very good at all. If we go to this yellow dot and select environment texture, it turns a glaring pink. That is because it is trying to reference something that doesn't exist yet or has been moved. In this case, we haven't referenced it yet. Hit open and go to the place where you have saved that HDRI and double click. There it is. This is looking really good, really quick. It looks very realistic. To get rid of that background, I like to work without the background. You would go to the render properties, find film, and check transparent. So you'll still have your reflections, but you won't have the world in the background. So there's that. Now we have one more material to create, and that is these elements, these glowing elements in the middle. So let's go into local view on those and back into material preview so we're not constantly rendering in the view there. Hit tab, or rather before going into edit, let's go back to properties tab, the material properties tab, and choose metal. And then we're going to add something else, a new material, and we're going to name it glow. You'll see that down here the name changed when I changed it here. That's because you can change it in either place and it does not matter. It still affects the model or the material's name. Let's go into edit mode, and there's actually some geometry here that we don't need. Control D will dissolve those. There we go. Now, I've noticed that we have not beveled anything here. It's going to be inside that blurry glass, so we'll see if we even end up needing that. We can change it at the end, or you can just change it if you want by adding all the bevels on the edges. We're not going to do that right now. So let's select this section, and with glow selected, we're going to assign. For the glow, let's choose a color, whatever color you think is going to look cool for yours on this color wheel. I had blue selected prior to this. Let's go with something else, like a yellow color. Maybe a yellowish green. I don't know, play with something till you find something you like. That looks really cool, actually. I'm going to make it transparent, so transmission to 1. And this will be giving off light, so it has to be an emission. So our emission color is what's actually going to matter, not our base color. But if you like that color and you're not sure how to exactly replicate it, you click here, and rather than dealing with this, hit your eyedropper, click here, and there you go, you've got the same thing you had before. Your emission strength will need to be something higher. The only way you're going to actually know what it looks like is to go to Render View, which is Z8, and see what that looks like. I'm going to modify my paint color as well. Because something else would be good. You know what? I'm just going to go with with black, the way I had the example in the beginning, or a gray color. There we go. Now, in order to actually make a real render, not just render view like this, we need a camera. So in front view, I'm going to add a camera. So that's Shift A, camera. And you may not want to be doing all this in render view. I don't know how powerful your computer is. Mine can generally do it with just a few objects like this. 0 on the numpad will go to camera view. G and double tap Z will move the camera along its Z axis, which is facing directly out. If you hit home now that you have a camera in there, you'll get the extents of your camera view. There we go. Let's add a plane for it to sit on. Now let's give this a test render. So let's get out of render view in there. And F12 is the shortcut key for render. But first, make sure you have your size set up the way you want here, and we want our number of render samples probably higher than 128. Let's 256 for now, and hit F12. If you have CPU rendering, you're going to see a bunch of small tiles forming. If you have GPU, you'll have large tiles like the one you're seeing now, and it'll be just one tile going around, rather than one for every CPU core that you have. Now, this is very well lit. However, let's make the lighting a little more dramatic so that we can't see the entire environment around it. If you want to save this render, you would go to Image, Save As, or Control Shift Alt S, and that will give you the option to save that somewhere. Alright, in order to get the scene that we are going for, we're going to have to ditch our HDRI lighting. As cool as it is, it's just not going to cut it for the look we're going for. So let's go over to our World Properties tab and turn the strength down to 0. And in fact, let's just take this back to RGB and make this completely black, which achieves the same thing. However, HDRIs take up quite a bit of memory and slow down your renders. So if you're not going to see it or use the lighting from it, take it out of the scene completely. So our floor cannot just be pure white. We're going to go and create a new material for it. And this one is going to be slightly procedural. So we're going to use a Musgrave texture. And this is like using a roughness map like we've downloaded. However, this is a procedurally generated one. So let's plug it into roughness and turn our color to something nearly black or black. Now you can see what that Musgrave texture is. And we're going to just Control-Shift-Click on it so that we can isolate it and do what we want to do. This will need to be turned up in scale, somewhere around there, detail all the way up to 16, and dimension needs to be taken down to something less than 1. So 0.4 maybe, something like that. See, it messes up the edges, makes it very blotchy, and the white areas are going to be roughest, black are going to be extremely glossy. So what we want to do is put a color ramp in there that softens the blow. It will take our whites down and our blacks up, and it'll make more of a less contrasty, more gray looking roughness mask. So the way we'll accomplish that is with the color ramp node. A color ramp node we've been using quite a bit, and you'll use in a lot of your materials. So let's go to camera view, look at what we have, and bring black to more of a gray, closer to the center, and do the same with white, but not nearly down so far. Make them close. Now if we go into rendered view, we're not going to see anything because we don't have any light. So what we'll do is move on to adding the lighting that we actually want. And the way we will do that is by adding area lamps and spot lamps. Let's start adding some area lamps. So in front view, let's say Shift A, down to light, and select area. Move that up a little bit, and we're going to be rotating around the cursor. So let's change that to cursor and rotate down a little bit. And from top view, you can be in perspective view, whatever you want to do, but it's easiest, I think, to go into your direct views without having to specify the angles or the axes that you want to move your objects and rotate them on. So in top-down view, we're going to Shift D to duplicate this, and R to rotate, bring it around, and it's going to be a larger lamp because this will be our key light, this will be the primary light, this will be the fill lamp, which needs to be larger to create softer shadows, and it's going to be a little more dim so that it is just filling in areas that would be completely in shadow. So let's scale it up a little bit and bringing it a little closer to where it's not quite touching the ground. A good idea at this point would be to hit Control B for the box select and select the area of your camera, and it will only render what's in that ant box, that red ant box. So now we can see that our light may need to be increased a little bit. So the way we'll do that is by going over into the light properties here, changing this up, say 20, 30. And the other one, we'll bring it to about half. So it's still lighting it, but it's not as bright as the other side. That gives you a little bit more dimension to what you are looking at. And then we want our rim light, which will kind of light up the edges to make it stand out from the black background. So speaking of black background, we want to go over to our Render tab and go down to Film and uncheck Transparent. And at the same time, let's go up here to our viewport layers or overlays and turn off that grid floor. Now we have a little bit better idea of what it is we're working with. So right now that's looking pretty good, but we want 2 more of these, or as many more as you want, in order to make an interesting scene, because this one just standing up here isn't doing much. And really, I just stood mine up like that in my final scene to give a good idea of what it is you'll be making in the tutorial. So let's go back to our solid view. Before we add our rim lights, we want to set up the scene. So we want to duplicate this stuff around. However, moving one thing causes everything else to simply stay behind. So what we can do is parent everything to an object, and a good type of object to use is an empty. So because you don't need to worry about hiding it or anything, an empty does not show up in a render. So let's add an empty, and we're going to select a sphere and bring that up to about the center. It does not matter where it is in relation to the object. However, I like to have it in the center and have the sphere kind of encompassing everything that will be parented to it. Again, the exact position really does not matter. So we can name that by hitting F2 or double clicking up there. But the way that you will parent things is select everything that needs to be parented. And it's best to just hide other stuff so it doesn't get in the way. H is hide. So let's select everything. Ooh, we do not want the ground. So let's select everything here. And whatever is your last selection, the primary selection, this yellow one, is going to be the thing that all of this parents to. So we have it correct. If you have something else as the primary, just shift select your empty last. And Control P is our parent menu. Click on Object. Now, when we move this object around, everything moves with it, including our empty here, which if it were to move on its own, you'd have weird things happen with your bolts. So we have this rotation, everything will work just fine. So now that we have that, let's go to median point, and now it rotates from the middle. So let's take all of this. That floor is really wanting to be selected. Alt D, unless you want colors to be varying between them, we want this to be Alt D, because this will create an instance rather than just a duplicate. So an instance means that if you edit one, you'll be editing the other one. It takes up less memory in your scene as well because it's referencing the same object data in a different object. If you want to know that everything is lined up and spaced correctly, what you can do is select your camera and we'll turn on some guides. So Alt-H to unhide everything, select our camera, and go down to Camera Settings, Viewport Display, Composition Guides, and Center will tell you what's dead on center. You'll have these dotted lines. Rule of thirds, if you're familiar with composition rules, this will help you determine your rules, your thirds. And it looks like we're pretty well centered already. We may want to bring our camera in a little, so G, middle mouse button, and move up. And move it up on the Z a little bit as well, so that we don't have so much empty space around. Let's pop into Render View and see what we're looking like. That is looking pretty good. We still need that rim lighting though around the edges to kind of differentiate the object from the dark background. So we're going to add some spot lamps in order to do that. So let's go back here into Solid View, Shift A, Light, and Spot. And we're going to add a few of these. So G, Z, and what we want is for this to, there we go, to light up only our objects and not really the floor or anything like that. So the way we'll accomplish that is to rotate this around the cursor. If we keep our cone above the ground floor, it will not be lighting up the floor plane that we set. So if we go back into Render and we choose our lamp wherever it may be, it's right there in the back. There we go. And rotate it around slightly. It's a little more than slightly. Right there. Go into Render Preview mode. That's really the only way you can preview the lights that you're putting in your scene. Let's change the power to something like 1000. And keep rotating around Z till it's highlighting the edges of our objects. Duplicate that around the scene. And that looks pretty good. We might not want our floor to be so reflective. The way you can adjust that would be with your color ramp here, making your colors that is using lighter. But we can also add a little bit of depth to that by adding a bump. Take our color, go to height, take normal to normal, and turn the bump down to something like 0.2 or 0.1. Now it's not completely smooth. It looks a little better, I think. And you can play with the scale. You can adjust everything until you've got the scene that you want, the exact image. I would suggest turning down the reflectiveness of the paint to contrast a little more with the shiny metal. Things look a little better when there's contrast between dark and light, shiny and rough, that kind of thing. So let's give this a test render. Once you've made all your adjustments, we'll go over here, and to this point I don't think I explained really what render samples are. The more samples you have, the less noise will be in your image. However, the longer it takes to get to your final image. Likewise, the larger your image, the more render tiles will be needed to render it all out, and that will cause it to take longer as well. So depending on your hardware, how long you're willing to wait, you can change your image size accordingly and your sample rate. Now, like I said, more samples will cause less noise. However, it'll greatly increase your render time. So one thing that we can do is denoise. So if we do a F12, you'll see that that's rendering through fairly quickly, but the finished tiles have quite a bit of noise in them. You have all this speckling. So I'm going to escape to cancel that. And we're going to go to render layers and turn on denoising data. And we can go into the compositor, which is kind of your post-processing. We'll use nodes, and on view, turn on backdrop, Shift A, so we're going to add a viewer. This looks a whole lot like your material editor, but it is not. Shift, right click and drag will divide that, so it'll split that up to our final render and our viewer, which is this. And let's add a denoise node. Take our noisy image node and our normal and our noisy albedo, and we'll plug it in here. Now when we made this render, we did not have those render layers turned on, so we're just going to get nothing here. So let's keep it plugged in the way it is, and let's come out here and let's do another test render, and we'll let it finish. Now we have this render, this final render, and there is no noise. However, you may notice a lack of detail. So denoising is kind of an art of finding what the minimum sample rate is that will give you a small enough amount of noise that the denoiser can take care of it without destroying your image. So if we minimize this and we maximize our compositor, we'll take image to here, and that is the original. But if we come out of our denoise and plug in here, you'll see what the denoising does. A good way to make this work a little better is to render a larger image. Again, that adds time, but sometimes that adds less time than having more samples. So this is really something you have to figure out over time and experience as to what your right combination of size and samples and denoising is going to be, and it's going to vary per scene that you do. More light, less light, more complex objects, it all plays in, and you have to experiment. So what I would suggest doing for our final render here is taking this all the way up to 2048 and letting it render, and having denoise turned on. This can be turned on and off at will after the render. It doesn't have to be plugged in ahead of time. If you were to use some other forms of denoising that are in this panel, they cannot be turned on and off or modified. This, however, adaptive sampling, will decrease your render time a bit depending on the scene. We have a lot of empty space here that it does not need to take as much time rendering on. This adaptive sampling will allow it to take less time on those. And this is the other denoising I was talking about. We'll leave that alone. This denoise node is really the best way to go about it. So let's set our sample rate, the size of the image, and hit F12. And there we have it, rendering at ludicrous speed. One last thing we can do in the compositor is add a little bit of lens distortion and chromatic aberration, and then our denoising won't be so obvious. It's not as bad as it was in our first render. So let's save this and call it something, save it, And if we exit without hitting render again, we can go in here to our compositor and we can add two nodes. One is glare. Change this streaks to fog glow and pop that in there. You'll see what it does in a second. Boom, there you go, you have some glow. Let's move our threshold up so that not everything is just glowing insanely. Maybe 5, 10, somewhere in the middle. Whatever strength works for your aesthetic is really what you want to go with. I don't think that in sci-fi, I don't think there's any real like need to make it super realistic unless you're doing it for the screen, for TV or something like that. Let's add our lens. Or lens distortion rather. And you'll see what that does. Maybe. No, we need to set how much it's distorted. 0.015. You want to stay with very low numbers with this, otherwise it's just so insane it doesn't look like anything good. You'll see I've got a little bit of blur around the edges and the colors start to separate. So if I did 0.1, you'd see this exaggerated quite a bit, like that. You have your RGB separating. That's something that you want to avoid in photography. Here we try and make a little bit of it to add realism, or just a cool factor. And there you go. We'll make sure it fits on the screen. And I think that looks pretty cool. If you want to now save that final, just bring up an image editor. In this drop down, these are all the images that are now in your file. Go down to render result. Once it catches up, it may not show your changes from your compositor immediately, but once it shows up, you can image, save as. And there you go. That is a great final render, I think. You can do plenty of tweaks on your own and post it to social media and tag Blender Forge. I'd love to see what you do with it. I hope you found this video helpful. Please like if you did, hit subscribe, and turn on notifications. Until next time, I'm Carl with Blender Forge, and I will see you later.